"Put that phone away." Those were my first words to him before a single piece of evidence, before a single witness, before the case had properly begun, to a 24-year-old man in a tailored blazer sitting in my courtroom with his ankle crossed over his knee and his phone in his hand like this proceeding was something happening near him rather than to him. I have been sitting on this bench for a very long time. I have seen confidence walk through that door in every form it takes. Old money, new money, inherited money, money that hasn't done anything yet but already knows it will. I have seen all kinds of entitlement, the kind that announces itself loudly and the kind that simply assumes without announcement that the room already understands. But I had never, not once in all my years on this bench, seen someone arrive at their own hearing with the specific, unhurried certainty that the room would accommodate whatever pace he decided to move at. This is my courtroom and the morning Dominic. Ashford walked in here, 24 years old, his father's name on 4 buildings within 6 blocks of this courthouse. I had absolutely no idea that the next few hours would leave every single person in this room completely silent. The case was called at 9:15 a.m. State versus Ashford, docket number car 22402441, reckless endangerment of a pedestrian, failure to render aid, hit and run within a private premises. Dominic walked in first. He was wearing a tailored charcoal blazer over a white shirt, dark jeans with a clean break at the ankle, and the kind of loafers that communicate without requiring anyone to look at the label that the person wearing them has never once had to think about the cost of shoes. He moved through the room with the unhurried, slightly distracted ease of someone who had been told to show up and had shown up and considered that the extent of what was being asked of him. He sat down without being directed. He crossed his left ankle over his right knee. He took out his phone. Behind him came Warren Finch, 34 years in civil and criminal defense, the kind of attorney whose assistant places calls to opposing counsel before cases are filed and whose favorable verdicts are followed by handwritten notes. On heavyweight stationery, he settled into his chair with a fluid, settled patience of someone who has occupied rooms like this one many times and has never once been surprised by how they concluded. Across the room, Patricia Asiai took her seat, 61 years old, 19 years as a home health aide, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, $14.2 an hour for the same agency without a single gap in her employment record. She set a thin folder on the table in front of her and placed both hands on top of it. She did not look around the room. She did not look at Dominic. She looked at the table with the quiet, undefended steadiness of a woman who has given everything she has for 19 years and has, on this particular morning, also simply had to get here. I introduced myself. I stated the case. I asked Dominic if he understood the charges against him. He glanced up from his phone, not at me, at a point somewhere in the general direction of the bench, and said nothing. I told Dominic to put the phone away before Patricia Asiai had spoken a single word. He did so with the slow, deliberate compliance of someone performing an enormous personal favor, sliding it into his jacket pocket with the unhurried energy of a person who expects to be thanked for the inconvenience. Patricia spoke without notes. She described the evening of November 11th in the same quiet, factual voice she would use to give someone directions, not because she was without feeling, but because she had clearly decided that feeling was not what she had come here to provide. She told me about the bus ride from her last patient's home, the stop at the grocery store on Eastfield because the patient's refrigerator had been nearly empty, and she had decided, without being asked and without any expectation of reimbursement, to pick up a few things: the parking garage, the elevator she was walking toward, the sound of the engine. She heard it before she saw anything, and then the concrete floor coming up at her, her wrists bending under her when she landed, looking up at the groceries scattered across the floor around her, looking up further to see the tail lights of the SUV continuing up the ramp without slowing, and then some minutes later a man walking past her toward the stairwell. She said that last part without particular emphasis, as a fact among facts. The man walked past her toward the stairwell. I watched Dominic while she spoke. He was not looking at his phone, but he was looking at a point approximately 4 inches above Patricia's head. Not at her, not away from her, at that specific, deliberate point that communicates the testimony occurring. In front of them is something happening near them rather than about them. I noted it first crack. When Patricia finished, I set down my pen and looked directly at Dominic Ashford. I asked him whether he had been aware after the incident that someone had been injured in the garage. He looked at me with the specific attention of someone recalibrating the first time all morning that my words had registered as something requiring a response rather than an ambient condition of the room. He straightened slightly. He said, "I wasn't aware of any contact. The garage was dark. There are visual challenges in that environment that I think are relevant to understanding my perception." Of events, the gallery went still, not with outrage, not with the compressed energy of people holding back a reaction, but with the specific, particular stillness of a room that has just heard a phrase and recognized it as something prepared, something rehearsed, something that no person genuinely uncertain about what happened reaches. 4. Innocent people say, I didn't see her. Innocent people say it was dark. They do not say there are visual challenges in that environment relevant to understanding my perception of events. That sentence was written by someone, and it was not written the night of November 11th. I said, your perception of events is on the footage. Let's watch it together. The footage was 44 seconds, the SUV entering the garage level at a speed that required no measurement to identify as inconsistent with any reasonable interpretation of 5 miles per hour. Patricia visible in the frame, walking toward the elevator, the vehicle striking her, clearly, unambiguously, without any visual challenge sufficient to explain the failure to notice, her falling, the SUV continuing up the ramp, Dominic emerging from the elevator on the ground level, walking past her without pausing and entering the stairwell. The gallery remained absolutely still. Dominic said, I think the footage needs to be reviewed by an independent expert before any conclusions are drawn from it. I said, I have drawn a conclusion from it. Your vehicle struck Patricia Asiai and you walked past her afterward. The conclusion is not complicated. Warren Finch rose with the unhurried ease of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment and has no concerns about what happens. Now that it has arrived, he was methodical. He addressed the lighting conditions in the Eastfield Street garage, the sodium vapor fixtures, the documented variance between the camera's low-light rendering and the human eye's actual visual capacity in that environment. He addressed the camera angle, acute, he said, relative to the vehicle's approach vector, creating a compression effect that could reasonably misrepresent both speed and proximity. He addressed the absence of any independent confirmation of contact beyond the footage itself. He delivered each point with a fluid, unhurried confidence of someone who has presented all of it before and watched the room find it reasonable. And then, with the seamless transition of a man who has built toward this moment from his opening sentence, he mentioned Richard Ashford, not as a threat, as context. The charitable endowment at the city's children's hospital, the affordable housing development completed on the South Corridor last year, employing over 300 workers from this city. The Ashford family's multi-decade investment in the civic infrastructure of the place this court is located in, the suggestion woven carefully into language about proportionality and community standing that a measured consideration of the circumstances before this court would naturally take into account the broader context of who the Ashford family is. The gallery felt it settle, that familiar particular weight of a name being placed on a scale. Dominic's at marginally straighter. The specific, almost imperceptible adjustment of someone who believes the mechanism has just been activated and is now simply waiting for the room to respond the way rooms I let Finch finish every sentence. Then I folded my hands on the bench, looked past him and said, Mr. Ashford, is your father in this courtroom today? Dominic's posture stopped. Finch did not turn. His junior associate, however, glanced involuntarily toward the rear of the gallery before she could stop herself. Dominic said his father may have come to observe. He had mentioned he might want to watch the process. Let's confirm that. I looked toward the gallery and said clearly and without elevation, Mr. Richard Ashford, if you are present, I'd ask you to identify yourself. What followed was the kind of stillness that does not know which direction the next moment is going to move. Not the held breath of anticipation, but the suspended breath of a room that is genuinely uncertain. Then from the third row, a man stood. Richard Ashford is 58 years old. He was wearing a dark wool coat and a pale blue shirt with no tie, and he looked almost nothing like the photograph from the gala program I had seen in the preliminary case file, smaller somehow, or simply unattended by the specific inflation that formal occasions produce in a person. He stood with his hands in front of him, not at his sides, not in his pockets, in front of him, the posture of someone who has decided something and is standing inside that decision. He did not look at me. He did not look at the gallery. He looked at his son. Dominic turned. Then from the third row, a man stood. Richard Ashford is 58 years old. He was wearing a dark wool coat and a pale blue shirt with no tie, and he looked almost nothing like the photograph from the gala program I had seen in the preliminary case file, smaller somehow, or simply unattended by the specific inflation that formal occasions produce in a person. He stood with his hands in front of him, not at his sides, not in his pockets, in front of him, the posture of someone who has decided something and is standing inside that decision. He did not look at me. He did not look at the gallery. He looked at his son. Dominic turned. He saw his father standing in the third row without his attorney, without his assistant, without any of the apparatus that the name Richard Ashford typically moves through the world accompanied by, and something in the managed vacancy that had held all morning, the ankle over the knee, the phone, the point above Patricia's head shifted in a way that could not be walked back. Richard Ashford walked to the front of the courtroom without being asked. He stood before the bench and spoke without prepared remarks, without the careful architecture of someone who has run the language through a communications team. He said his son struck a woman in a parking garage and walked away from her while she was lying on the ground. He said he had watched the footage the evening before the hearing. He said there is no lighting condition and no camera angle and no independent expert review that changes what is visible in that footage, and he was not going to stand in this courtroom and imply that there might be. Then he turned to face Patricia O'Shea. He apologized to her, not as a developer, as the father of the man who walked past her. Then he faced the bench. Your Honor, my family's name and my charitable contributions and my development projects have nothing to do with what my son did in that garage. I want to say that clearly in this room on the record. He will face what this court decides. I will not make a call, and I will not send an attorney to make a call on my behalf. Whatever happens today happens. The room did not erupt. Patricia O'Shea looked at Richard Ashford for a long moment with the careful, undefended steadiness that had been with her since she sat down. Then she looked at her folder and placed her hands back on top of it. Dominic was looking at his father with the expression of someone watching a floor they have always stood on, revealed that it has a different load-bearing capacity than they had ever been required to test. I put my glasses back on. Mr. Ashford, I have presided over this courtroom for a long time. I have seen every form that purchased confidence takes when it walks through that door. Family names on buildings, charitable galas with the mayor in attendance, attorneys who send handwritten notes after favorable verdicts and place calls before unfavorable ones can develop. And in every case, without exception, the facts have been the facts. I looked at him directly. Your facts are on 44 seconds of parking garage footage. A 61-year-old woman who had just worked a 12-hour shift caring for an elderly patient stopped at a grocery store on the way home with her own money, without being asked, without being compensated, to pick up food for that patient because the refrigerator was empty. She was struck by your vehicle in a posted 5-mile-per-hour zone while walking toward the elevator. She fell, her wrist fractured, her groceries scattered across the floor, and you walked past her on the way to the stairwell. Those are your facts, Mr. Ashford. Nothing said in this courtroom this morning has altered them by a single word. I am going to rule on them. The ruling was this: guilty on all 3 counts, reckless endangerment of a pedestrian, failure to render aid, hit and run within a private premises, full restitution. To Patricia O'Shea, $1,540 in lost wages, $380 for the medical treatment of her fractured wrist, $47 for the groceries she bought for someone else that were ruined when she fell, a total of $1,967 to be paid within 21 days, paid by Dominic Ashford directly, not through any Ashford family account, not through any entity associated with Ashford Development, not through Warren Finch's office as an intermediary, by Dominic within 21 days. Dominic's driver's license suspended for 1 year, effective immediately. 240 hours of community service assigned to the city's elder care volunteer program, direct service transportation. Grocery assistance in home companionship for elderly residents who depend on people like Patricia O'Shea, a minimum of 6 hours per week. The program director will report his attendance and his conduct to this court monthly. Conduct counts: a handwritten letter of apology to Patricia O'Shea, not drafted by Warren Finch, not reviewed by Richard Ashford's communications team, written by Dominic in his own hand, submitted to this court within 10 days. If I do not find it genuine, he will write it again. From the third row, Richard Ashford spoke quietly. One condition of his own: Dominic's access to the Ashford family accounts was suspended for the full duration of the service requirement. His own transportation to every assignment, his own expenses. I have put his name on buildings. He said, I should have made sure he understood what it means to earn one. Dominic looked at his father, the managed vacancy, the ankle over the knee, the phone, the point above Patricia's head, the visual challenges, was entirely gone. What was left was a 24-year-old man sitting in a chair without any of the insulation he had walked in with, and the specific undefended look of someone who has just discovered that the distance between who they are and who they were raised to be is larger than they knew. 6 months later, the elder care program director sent a note to my clerk. Dominic Ashford had completed 94 of his 240 hours. He had not missed a single assignment. In the 4th week, another volunteer had arrived early and noticed that Dominic's car was parked outside the location. He had been sitting in it for 11 minutes before coming in. The director did not know what he was doing in those 11 minutes, but he had gone in, and that, she wrote, told her something she had been watching for. He had learned to drive within the city's residential speed limits without being reminded. He had begun, the director wrote, to learn the names. The apology letter arrived on the 9th day. It was 2 pages. It did not mention the lighting conditions in the Eastfield Street garage. It did not mention what His father's name appears on. It said that he had driven past someone lying on the ground and had not stopped, and that he had not understood, had genuinely not understood, until he started showing up for people what it costs when someone does not. He wrote that he had been thinking about the groceries Patricia Osei bought for someone else. He wrote that he intended to understand that better. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer because some days I sit on this bench and wonder whether the distance between the person who walks in and the person who might eventually walk out is crossable, whether the 11 minutes in the car amount to anything, whether going in any way means what I want it to mean. And then I open the drawer, and then I know. Late in the afternoon, after the gallery is emptied and the bailiff has gone home and the room has gone quiet, I sometimes sit at this bench alone for a few minutes. I think about a 24-year-old man who walked in with his ankle over his knee and his phone in his hand, and the absolute certainty that this room would move for his father's name the way every other room had always moved for it. It didn't, because justice is not about whose name is on the building outside. It is about the 44 seconds on the footage, the groceries bought for someone else, the 11 days a woman could not work, and the 3 patients who called to ask where she was, and the room that reads all of it and says what it says, regardless of what is on the buildings within 6 blocks. Dominic Ashford walked in insulated. He sat in the car for 11 minutes outside a volunteer location on a Tuesday morning and then went in anyway. That is the distance between the man who walked past someone on the floor of a parking garage and the man who goes in anyway. That distance is not nothing. That distance is, in my experience, exactly what this room is for. Share this if you believe that showing up for other people matters more than whose name is on the building. Subscribe, because the stories I bring you are the ones that prove it still does. In this courtroom, everyone is equal, every single one.